We are here for containers, exploits, surprises, and security. It's kind of rare for me to be one of the more technical talks. I think I'm really grateful to be here at this event, which highlights the importance of inclusion in DevOps. So really grateful to the organizers and to the sponsors and to all of you for coming down. I am kind of like an attention magnet. I love like all of it, and I'm not particularly shy or private. So really like feel free to tag anything that you see from this talk that you think is interesting or worthwhile. And all props to Beyonce for wanting to, vet any images of her. I'm not that fussy. So my hashtag, we've got DevOps Days for the event, and Elizabeth on Twitter, and Elissa is off message if you want to tag me on Instagram. Containers are really interesting right now because of the way that they're starting to dominate, just completely dominate the ecosystem. At some point, Mark Andreessen famously said, software is eating the world. And that was true for a long time. And I'd argue now that containers are eating software. I'm sure all of you are really familiar. If you weren't when you got here, then you are after yesterday with some of the basics of containers, but I think it's worthwhile from a security perspective to take a look at Docker and Kubernetes in terms of who they say they are and what they're promising. Docker says outright that it's the world's leading software containerization platform. And I suppose that that's true. And Docker's promise, among other things, is security. They promise to deliver applications safer across the entire lifecycle with built-in security capabilities and configurations out of the box. So I really don't want to throw shade on Docker too much, but the promise here really would be that you don't need to do any work beyond the defaults. And that's not exactly true. Out of the box, that's what they say. Kubernetes is an orchestration system for containers like Docker. According to Google, Kubernetes is the industry-leading open source container orchestrator which powers Kubernetes engine. Containers have become so pervasive that, in fact, Google calls containers the Google way. Containers are the Google way now. I was really struck by that. From Gmail to YouTube to search, everything at Google runs in containers. Did anyone here know that? Is that news? I was surprised. So it's kind of like the early days of the web or the early days of software, where these technologies are becoming ubiquitous, but that doesn't mean that the security is there, right? Like Docker and Kubernetes were built up initially with the aims of scaling and trying to become feature complete, but we're still building the security infrastructure for these new technologies, which is the reason why there aren't that many security experts on containers, actually. I had a really interesting time kind of building the materials for this talk and being kind of surprised that there isn't more information out there. Hopefully over the next few years we'll see that. And I've been inspired to do more. And sure, there are fancy exploits. And when I initially proposed this talk, I thought that that would be the heart of what I would want to discuss. But as it turns out, the biggest risk is just good old misconfiguration. I wanted to show like a better image of a hacker. So we've got like woman hacker hacking Kubernetes. Apparently she's like a real hacker, like a real. And she also wants to be known for her work, not for being a woman hacker, but I figure she would be okay with this. So when it comes to the exploits and the hacks that are happening in the container space, I also was disappointed at how mundane some of them are. We're used to taking really strong measures to protect user data, from the kinds of exploits and the kinds of threats that we usually think about. But as it turns out, hackers are mostly after Monero. Monero is a private cryptocurrency. That's what the little gold M is. For the most part, as I looked to see what hacks had been happening in the wild, it's Monero hackers trying to get into your S3 bucket. And I found a lot of examples like this. This person documented 2 different sets of hackers who had broken in and were fighting over who got to use, the bucket. An important hack to look at recently was Tesla. Has anyone, raise your hand if you're familiar with the recent cryptojacking attack on Tesla. Anyone here? Okay, good. This will be new for you. This was really embarrassing for Tesla because they're supposed to be, a really grown-up company, but they had a completely unsecured Kubernetes console, and it had the AWS credentials right there. So Monero miners were able to infiltrate the console because it wasn't even password protected. And this happened at Tesla. And within one pod, the access credentials were exposed to AWS. It also had sensitive data, like telemetry, but the hackers weren't really after that. They just wanted to mine for Monero. Isn't that something? I guess that's fortunate for Tesla. And there's some interesting lessons in how the hackers went about things. They were actually really clever. These weren't just script kiddies. They were really methodical. They hid their IP address behind Cloudflare. The mining software was configured to listen on a non-standard port. And most importantly, the CPU usage was not high. So that let them go undetected. And there's some lessons for those of us who want to avoid this sort of thing. Secure your Kubernetes with passwords. This seems like a really minimum thing for any enterprise environment. Really, if you can password protect something, you probably should. That's really low-hanging fruit. You're with me, right? We should be using passwords? Thank you. Yes, passwords is the very minimum. I wish this talk were more sophisticated in terms of the mistakes that people were making. You need to update and monitor your configurations. The defaults just aren't enough. And if there's one theme that's emerged for me in doing this research, it's that. It's that contrary to what Docker said and also to what Kubernetes, kind of the way that they describe things on the website, actually there's a lot of work that users need to do to get the configurations right. You need to monitor your network traffic. So this is true for containers, but it's really just basic security practice if you want to know if hackers have gotten in your network. How will you know? You need to know what's normal for your network. So if you're engaging in network monitoring, when there's a change, you'll see that change and you'll know the difference. This is important, by the way, if and when you do experience a hack, because the forensics people will come in and they'll want to know your baseline and they'll want to see your logs. And if you don't have that, it's going to be really hard for them to do their job. Also, hackers will leverage one resource to gain access to another. This is another theme that kept coming out as I looked into the various Kubernetes and Docker hacks. So Kubernetes can be a gateway to S3, for example. And we see this all the time. Folks have the AWS passwords, say, in their GitHub, and figure that the GitHub is private. But if a hacker gets into GitHub, then they get to see everything that's there. This is surprisingly common. And a hat tip to Redlock for their research on the Tesla cryptojacking. And there's a link at the bottom. I'll make some of this public. I'll publish a Medium post with the various links that I thought were really interesting for folks who want to go into a deeper dive into what happened at Tesla. And Redlock has done a lot of interesting research into the various Monero hackers. Another example, this comes from Alexander Urquioli at Handy. And one of his colleagues had a personal Kubernetes deployment running on top of Alpine Linux. So it wasn't a corporate thing, but it was still a surprise when it got hacked. So everyone inside Handy saw what happened, and Alexander documented it. The first indicator of compromise was a suspicious process running as a child of the Docker daemon. Code is there. Wait. Sorry about that. And curling the endpoints leads to mining proxy online. So that was a hint that something was wrong. That's not supposed to happen. That's not what we do here. Here's the script that was used to mine Monero. And when you run it against virus check, you can see that it's like a common script used to mine Monero. What can we learn from this? The API server was publicly exposed to the internet, but it seems to be protected with certificate authentication. And by default, there's this issue where it was just accepted. Requests to the HTTPS endpoint that are not rejected by having configured it a certain way were just treated as anonymous requests and were given a username, which is a problem. So they've fixed this. Unless you specify some flags on kubelet, the default was just to accept unauthenticated API requests. So that's a problem, and that was outstanding as an issue since 2015. But there are a lot of reasons why this hadn't been resolved by the Kubernetes team. Finally, they just did, which is one reason why I'm able to talk about this. Also, it's been published, but this exploit has been closed, hence here. So it's been an issue on GitHub, and it was just patched, which is great. Some things about that. There was a comment made that it should be a CVE, and the counterpoint to that is that it's not a CVE, it's not a vulnerability, it's a misconfiguration. So, I think these misconfigurations end up being the equivalent of vulnerabilities because there are ways for hackers to get into your system. So we end up with a lot of semantics around, what is the thing, but at the end of the day, the users are still vulnerable. And so this was just closed in February. So it's very important to pay attention to configuration. Both Docker and Kubernetes need this. And also you need to do your patches because this issue was just patched. So if you're using an older version of Kubernetes, then you're vulnerable to this exploit that's already been published and widely documented. So if I was trying to get into people's systems, I might look to see which companies aren't doing regular updates, and that's a hint to me that they'll be vulnerable to this. I never want to do my patches or updates, so I understand why it's hard. It's hard for a lot of organizations for a lot of reasons. I don't know what we can do about that. I think that that's another interesting topic to dive into. When organizations don't have the resources, when they can't, you look at people in emerging economies, they don't have the resources to always be up to date on everything. So we need to deal with that at some point. But for us now, the takeaway is still, patch your stuff. So I wanted to see what the Kubernetes team had to say about best practices. And they have a lot to say, but they don't go deeply enough into the importance of just patching and updating your configurations. Most of the exploits that I'm seeing happening in the wild are really coming down to that. So there's a lot of more advanced work that we can all do, but if you update your configurations and you keep things patched, you'll avoid a lot of the low-hanging fruit that some of these Monero script kiddies and other hackers are actually going after. Best practices via the Kubernetes team. You want to implement continuous security vulnerability scanning. So there are all of these tools, and I'm going to be publishing a list for that and sending it to the organizers and tagging on Twitter, because I think it's really interesting, really important. There are different tools that will scan your containers and your Kubernetes to see against known vulnerabilities. And you need to do this on a regular basis because the new vulnerabilities are published all the time. So, that seems like good advice. You need to regularly apply security updates to your environment. Okay, there we go. You need to do the patching. You need to ensure only authorized images are used in your environment. I thought I'd go through this kind of fast because there's so much. Limit direct access to Kubernetes nodes. Create administrative boundaries between resources. That makes sense, right? Because you need to keep things isolated. Define resource quota. That makes sense because you don't want something to come in and start using all of your resources. That's also a sign that something's wrong. Implement network segmentation and log everything. Best practices via Docker. Only trusted users should be allowed to control your Docker daemon. Best practice is to remove all capabilities except those explicitly required for their processes. That's Docker's way of saying you need to update your configuration. They don't say it in those words, but that's this theme that keeps coming out. And there's some links at the bottom for the different documents that Docker's been coming out with recently. They've done some good work on this, but I think there's a need to start spelling these things out in ways that are, I think, more clear to the average developer. More from Docker. We need proper tooling. Docker Bench for Security is one example. A bunch of folks have asked me about tooling since I got to this event, so I think I want to put together some kind of resource specifically for that, but the Docker Bench for Security seems to be really good and people are using it in the field. I've gotten recommendations. And they also say you should run your Linux kernels with grsec and packs and advise that that's not just for containers but good all around. Sorry for my typo, and you can expand upon the default configuration to improve security. All right, so those are the best practices from Kubernetes and from Docker. I wanted to boil it down into ways that are more concise. So let's go through 5 straightforward techniques. 1 is just do your updates. 2, minimize the attack surface. Do you need that extra code? What about the proprietary code that is who knows how many vulnerabilities? People kind of like to layer things on, but that can introduce, a range of issues. You need to optimize your configuration. Again, with the patch that happened in February, there was the note that it's not a CVE, it's a misconfiguration. Know your network. This is from Andrew Case, who does forensics. And he says you have to monitor your network for unusual activity. And I'm happy to take some questions about that at the end. I was doing a case study with one company that's dealing with sensitive health data. And they needed to have that health data behind encryption and following HIPAA compliance. But then they also needed their researchers to be using Redshift to access data differently. And so they had one bucket, and it was with Aptable, that does HIPAA compliance security. And then they had another that was in S3. And what they did is they put the Redshift data behind a VPN. They just took it off the public internet. I haven't seen this discussed as a tool anywhere, but it's obviously really good best practice. Having things exposed through the public internet introduces a range of various attack surfaces. And obviously if you take things offline, you put it behind a VPN, you take it off the public internet, that adds additional protection. So I think that's a really good approach. I'm surprised it's not discussed more publicly, but it's very effective. All right, so I saw this graphic from Rihanna, and I just thought it was like the funniest thing. So I don't want to totally close the talk. We'll take some questions, but a round of applause for me. You can keep it short. And I also really want to thank DevOps Atlanta. I think this is a really special event. I think it's really important that we look at how inclusivity plays into DevOps. We can't just keep talking about the technology piece of running these businesses without taking into account that there are people, and we need to optimize around like the people operations, and people have like feelings, and we need to make space for all the different people who can contribute. And I think this event has done more than anything in recent memory to teach me a lot, and I like to think that I'm knowledgeable in this space, but there's so much that I've learned about what it means to include everyone and to work together. So thank you for that, and I appreciate everyone here for also cheerleading security and the importance of security in DevOps and just in general. I've been heartened to see like how much people really care about container security, and that they're also seeing what I'm seeing, which is that there's like not enough work being done out there, that we need to level that up. So I tend to keep my talks a little bit short and then try and get people a little bit engaged. It's kind of early in the morning, so I think that's probably a good way to go. Does anyone here have an example of a best practice, something that you've seen in your organization that you think would be worth sharing? A worst practice? I'm sorry?
AWS, use a VPC.
Yes.
Use
VPC
a
peering.
VPC.
Yeah, can you say any more on that?
Yeah. So by default now, Amazon pretty much puts things behind what's called a virtual private cloud, a VPC, and they configure one by default for you in every single region in like the 172.20 space, and they're pretty nice because it keeps things off the internet, even though that's like against Google's grand vision of everything being public, which is why they probably prefer all Kubernetes to be unsecured on the internet. But yeah, just like use the VPC. You can actually ask me about them. You can connect them to your office networks through what's called the VPC VPN, which is a private, like, just over a tunnel to your office. You can use BGP to configure it. They're pretty nice, so use them.
Yeah, I think that that's a really excellent best practice, and I suppose that all these companies do have some interest in keeping things more public-facing, but those of us who care about security and want to secure our data have an interest in making things less public. That's the point of securing the data, right?
System where I was saying it's more the cynic's view of like the MongoDB and Redis philosophy, where listening on everything, being public makes it easier for adoption, and then once you're mature enough, you can start caring about security. So, I mean, it seems like strange for Google to take that path, but it's the only conclusion that can be made if they refuse, if they by default launch things insecurely on the internet, it's because it's easier for people to use. Because, I mean, that's what Mongo did.
But it makes it harder because you have to do all these patches after the fact. And so,
but that doesn't matter because you've already won the market.
Right. Yeah, so I'm all for that. Anyone else? Best practices, worst practices that you've seen?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, both of y'all. I think it's interesting you brought up misconfiguration versus like a full-blown CVE. And I think that is it, that it's, who here has done any like desktop support work? Exchange server support, that kind of stuff. And you go through and secure everything, and the owner of the company comes in and says, I need everyone to have full admin rights on every shared folder on the network. And you're like, that is a terrible plan. Like, am I the only one that's experienced this?
Right. It's secure until you ship it.
Right. Well, and sometimes it's not, because they want to avoid that, where for a group of folks that doesn't understand sharing files over a network, which is still a thing, everybody's in their own space. It's cool. They're learning. But the securities can be really, really frustrating. They don't want to do two-factor authentication. They don't want to have to type in a password. I actually got accused once of playing this game to rack up more hours. Well, then I got to call you every time I want to change something. I was like, you don't have a full-time tech person on staff, so you're actually getting off kind of light. but not always a shared perspective.
Any other stories? Please.
I'm a-coming. They can't hear you on the internet without the microphone.
Wait, this is going onto the internet? I've heard that's good there. Hello, internet.
Hi, everyone.
So one of the things we've been doing with ERMI is if I didn't understand it, I turned it off, which is why we use, I like no one Docker command, and everything else is off. So I think that's kind of a good approach to things. Like when I was first looking at AWS, I was kind of like, woo, kid in the candy store, I could EMR this, I could do one of these, or one of these, one of these, one of these. And then as soon as I kind of read the documentation, so like 6 paragraphs in, and I'm like, I don't know what one of those is, or one of those, or one of those. I was like, okay, turn it off. So that's pretty much been our default of just turn everything. If I can't write down what it does on a napkin, I turn it off.
Right. Well, and that's the danger where the defaults aren't necessarily secure. Both Docker and Kubernetes advise that you do additional configuration. And so if you don't understand everything in your system, it may or may not be secure. And all the extra code can also add, it adds potential vulnerabilities you might not know about. So that's really good advice. Even though the candy store is fun. Right. Well, and it is a barrier to entry. I was trying to build a security company, and it's hard to get traction and get users without using a growth mindset, using a security mindset instead. And so you end up where companies do need to prioritize growth if they want to win the market quickly, but then there's this obvious downside that is like this terrible externality affecting all of us.
Well, and I read a report recently, somebody's home machine, they were running kubelet and didn't have it in a subnet and ended up getting exploited that way. So, did you cover that? I had to go dip out and round up sponsors, but did we talk about subnetting?
We did not.
So
Please.
Anybody want to talk about subnetting? Because I'm talking all the time. Anybody got subnetting for security? It's I think the analogy is a fox in the hen house, that if they're cordoned off on a subnet and it can't talk to other places on your network, there's a limited amount of damage that can be done. And it's,
Right.
kubelet is one of these things, you spin it up and you want it in full access because you want to get the thing working. But like dropping back and putting that on a private subnet on your home network is going to mitigate a lot of risk. It's not going to keep somebody from getting out necessarily. It's just they're going to be real bored when they get in there because there's nothing shiny to play with. And same thing for IoT stuff, right?
Right.
Your IoT stuff should be on a subnet. A Nest thermostat is a good way to get in, and they can move laterally across the network and do things like,
Well, that just happened with the fish tank in Vegas. Some hackers got into a casino in Vegas through the IoT device in the fish tank. It was the thermometer, right? Yeah, so one of the benefits of containers, in theory, is that you can build in all this isolation, but you have to do it.
Yeah, you can't leave the back door open. That won't work.
All right.
Ooh, we got one in the back. We've got time, so we're taking it. I'm having fun. I think this is
I'm having a lot of fun. Thank you for this.
This is why we started early.
Hi.
Hi.
We chatted a little bit yesterday, so
We did. Thank you
it
for
was
that.
it was really good. One of the things I wanted to ask about is your thoughts on zero trust networking, so things like Calico and policy-based security to tighten down, not allowing internal services to cross chatter and stuff like that.
That seems like the same concept as subnetting in terms of isolation, right? Like you want to minimize exposure. That seems like a really basic good security practice. You don't want to grant any more access than you need to. So I haven't spent as much time with like those particular pieces of software, but the practice in general is a good one. You don't want to grant any more access than you need to. Do you have any other thoughts on it? You want to elaborate?
Yeah, so I've just started.
So I just started working with it after KubeCon back in Austin, and working through some of the issues. And I like the idea of being able to label the different resources within Kubernetes and services and stuff that you want to allow traffic between. And if it's not labeled to talk, it can't.
Right.
That's
really
then
important.
That goes beyond, whatever the particular subnetting and stuff is too. So, it's a interesting, way of doing it. The other side of it that is kind of being forced in the data center side is Citrix ACI, which is very painful. So. Just prepare yourself.
Thank you for the warning.
Is anybody running a Bastion server? I'm talking more cloud security stuff right now.
Yeah,
You got
we've got
one
a hand
person,
going up right there and there.
couple hands going up. Who wants to talk about Bastion servers a minute? Let's get this guy on.
Not sure what to say, but we use, it's basically our point of entry for all maintenance, and it's how our configuration management stuff connects. Basically, we just put a proxy server on the backside of the Bastion, and so all traffic goes through there, and on that system, which is a very minimal system, has almost nothing on it. We have limited access that goes through there, and it all has to be encrypted. And
That's awesome.
yeah,
We'll get Rob on too. It's I've seen this model where there's very limited traffic through Bastion. A lot of stuff is being driven through API credentials because it's easier to invalidate that.
Yeah, one thing that we've been experimenting with, if you're using AWS, is AWS run command. So you actually don't have to even have any outside access for your VPC because you can execute run command and execute scripts and execute custom commands inside your VPC without ever even entering the VPC. So that's been we're kind of experimenting with that pattern.
What are you using it for?
So if we we run a serverless application, but it has a Aurora database on the back end. So if we need to run database migrations, then we can just run those commands inside a container that lives inside the VPC without ever, accessing the VPC.
Cool.
And yeah, one of the things we're doing to try to catch up with the configuration game is we find out that the risk-averse organizations find out that they're in a better position if they're doing continuous integration because they can respond to a 0-day in time.
Right, it's so fast.
Right. Seth mentioned it during his talk that he provisioned GPC resource, and he was like, it's probably getting hit right now for the Drupal exploit. Like they're on it. The threat is using the automation, right? They've automated this stuff. So yeah, if y'all wanna, this is a deep talk, right? Like there's some stuff Elissa was talking about that I'm like, I need to go Google that. I'm not sure what she's talking about. So just a level set here. This was an advanced talk. Very good though.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And you're welcome to ask me questions. You have my Twitter handle. I can bring it back. You can send me questions there. And if you don't want to ask it publicly, my DMs are open. So if you have any questions based on this talk or really relating to container security in general, I'm giving this talk a few more times, and I really want to know what questions people have, and I also want to try and be a resource to the community because one of the things that came out for me is, we need more people doing that.
Absolutely. And are you able to hang out for an open space this afternoon?
Yeah, I'm going to hang out, and also I wasn't able to bring that many copies of my book because they're heavy and I don't check bags, but I have 3 copies that I can sell basically at cost. So if you want to pick up my book after, you can do that too.
Or we can raffle them off, and the
Yeah.
conference will just buy them for me.
Yeah,
Does that work?
would be great.
Does that sound good to y'all? So, and I'll give one final shout out to Sonatype here with dependency management, 0-day vulnerability stuff. They do have a good solution, so go ask them about Lifecycle. I'm sure we'll talk more about all this in open spaces.
Yep.
But for now, thank you so much, Elissa. Let's give her a big
Oh.
round of applause. Awesome.